Welcome to another episode of Energy Bites. I'm Bobby Nealon. We've got the rad dad, John Califan, here with us.
How's it going?
And excited to have Kurt Rucker in from Colorado, the applied science manager at Verdad Resources. Is that right?
I'm happy to be here.
All right. Well, welcome down to beautiful Houston, Texas.
It's awesome. It's nice and cool.
I was going to say, you picked a good time. It's been the most comfortable end of August that I think we've had in a very long time.
Yeah, and it didn't seem like that about 3 weeks
ago. No,
in.
yeah, we went from the hottest week of the year to some of the most comfortable.
Houston.
Very
Everybody's
quickly.
complaining about the weather down here.
Just wait
that's
a
not
day.
the perk.
Are you from this area? From Dallas?
I grew up in Dallas.
Okay, because I saw the 512 phone numbers. Like, so he's not from
Austin
Colorado originally,
school.
and then I was trying to figure out where the connection was. But well, cool. But I know we were chatting a little beforehand. But I mean, it's kind of actually remarking just how not nearly as many people in oil and gas were aware of Halliburton's cyber attack,
right?
Including myself.
You would imagine, especially people that are tied in. But just we can talk a little bit. I mean, it looks like seems like some ransomware, which is becoming more and more frequent, and just kind of interested to get you guys' thoughts on that and just that potential risk for oil and gas in general.
Yeah, so it says they believe it's a group called Ransom Hub. This is from a TechCrunch article I'm reading, but and of course Halliburton came out today, as of this recording at least, and said that they don't believe the hack is going to affect their bottom line, which all good PR firms would say. But
they're doing their job right now, clearly.
Yes. I mean, the fact that most people don't know about it, I think, shows that they're doing a very good job and probably deserve a little bonus after this.
At least they're doing a good job of keeping it.
That's what I'm saying.
Managed. You hope that the real work is on the back end of getting a solution worked up.
But it just says, they're still evaluating the nature and the scope of the information that was stolen, and they're not commenting on what or how or any information about it. But brings us back to, we talk about hacks, I feel like every other month on here. And I think it'll be, I don't know if we'll ever hear any of the details about it, but I do think it'll be very interesting with how much, especially shit we talk about IT being barriers for tech innovation. It will be interesting to see if this was a, outside penetration or if this was just like a phishing email or something generic like that.
Well,
password.
It's definitely scary too. Cause this is a big Fortune, whatever, 500, whatever company, publicly traded company. And again, who conceivably you would think has their IT shit together, a lot more, it literally has to with SOX compliance and everything like that. I mean, to be at a mid-sized company like us and, y'all are smaller size. I don't want to speak for everyone, but we did a good job of securing our stuff, but not nearly to the degree probably that of publicly traded company does, or you would hope that they do. That anyone's at risk, and I've even heard of smaller players getting hit, even in the last month or two. So it's definitely an exposure that people need to think of. And even do you have cybersecurity insurance? Your CFO, I don't want to pay that. Well, do you want to pay the ransom? Curious to get your thoughts.
For oil and gas, it's funny because we we have expensive engineers, and we think that the data that they're using is highly correlated or real closely connected to the expensive decisions they're doing. So your insurance, what are you really insuring? Because if you actually lost the data, the value of it, how do you handle that? That gets pretty complicated quickly. Yeah. And then you've got thousands or hundreds, depending on the size of your company, of employees, and each one of them is a point of failure. Unless I think when you're designing cybersecurity or just your data governance across your organization, being able to think about not just one failure is almost guaranteed over an organization large enough. So then how do you accept that that's going to be part of it and design around it, as opposed to try and defend against one eventuality? Because all one attack has to do, one attack gets in and it's game over.
I think it's a matter of, obviously to your point, there's acceptable risk. You have to, if you get rid of all the risk, then people can't do their work.
Right.
Right. I've heard of companies removing all the USB drives from.
It goes back to I remember someone saying if if I want to hit a really straight golf shot, I'll use my putter.
Yeah.
But like I can't use that the whole way down the course, right?
The
So sometimes I have to decide, is it worth trying to pull the driver out or, a 5-iron, whatever it is.
It depends on the game. If somebody's going to say, you lose a child if you go off the course, you might putt the whole way. It could be worth it.
Yeah.
No, that's a very good way to look at it. It's, man, that's one of those things. It's like, as an engineer who just wants to solve problems, that like the fact that there's essentially always a problem there is fascinating to me, but also terrifying at the same time, right? It's like you have to design so that with the expectation almost that there will be penetration of some sort, whether it's phishing or password, whatever. And so it's like, that's just such a hard for me to wrap my head around. Like, okay, I know it's going to happen, but if it is going to happen, we just need to make sure it's designed so that we can contain it, identify it, separate it, back it up, and keep things moving.
There's a book called The Systems Bible, and it's full of a bunch of kind of one-liners or quotes and comments about large systems and design. It's, I think, from the 70s. But one of the key points that the author makes, whose name I'm drawing a blank on, is that the default mode of operation for a complex system is failure, not wild success. And as engineers, we like to think of, I'll say I'm scientist, but the engineering mindset is to assume that I've designed this delicate, wonderful system and it's going to work just how I designed it, as opposed to it's going to be breaking all the time. What does it look like when it's breaking? Yeah. And if it's unmanageable, if it means my data is locked away or gone or public, if that can't work, then your system probably isn't really well suited for what you're doing. And as organizations, I think we've moved from an industry that was more straightforward to one that's much more difficult to manage and to understand, harder to perceive and less intuitive.
Sure.
And that I think this Halliburton discussion is an example of one of those places where it's becoming so hard to manage, but we've built our structure around assuming it's simpler. And how companies make that shift is, I think that's the problem that all of us are dealing with right now.
Yeah. And to your point, because again, they're big and they should have, and I'm sure they do have their stuff together.
That's the thing. I don't want to make this
seem
like we're just dumping all over them.
But giving them credit.
But the bigger they are, like again, you talk about points of failure. You have thousands of employees. You have however many IoT devices, cameras.
I was thinking the same thing.
All these different points of entry into a system, and you'd like to think you could think of all of them and the possible ways people can penetrate those, but I mean, it's difficult.
It's almost, I would say it's impossible, but I don't know. That's not really my world, so I can't really say that. But it's when there's people that have been hacked. There was one recently, and I can't remember. I feel like it was a State Department or something, but coming in through a thermostat.
Yeah.
What? I didn't even know that was possible.
Yeah.
And to imagine, so then you talk about IoT in the field. Trying to protect against that sounds pretty difficult.
And like Jeff Hughes will tell you, most places you can walk out on the field and there's probably like the admin password on the inside of the of the box, depending on the company. It is funny you were saying that because I think it was like the AWS CTO. I mean, he may still be, but he was back then. But I mean, his whole motto was everything breaks all the time.
Yeah,
you have to design with that in mind. And I think AWS and I think Netflix. I mean, they put their infrastructure through the ringer constantly and are going through like drills and stuff like that, because it's just, if you want to have that high availability that you say you want, then you have to really know how to anticipate and be ahead of the curve.
Saying you have it versus testing it and actually proving that it can do that is a very different.
It's like, we're secure. All right, let's go do some pen testing. No, give me a couple months to fix this couple of things.
Imagine like a white hat, black hat, or oil and gas conference of go out into the field.
That would be
awesome. In Midland, and we're going to let's see what we can do. Let's go play.
I think that would
rock. Let's go to Joel Catters.
IT. I mean, we're totally down to host that. Good luck getting operators to sign up for that. But you guys both in? Is that what I'm hearing?
Then do it in Saudi Arabia. I'm sure you could find some way to pull something off because that would be amazing.
Yeah, you can do Grayson Mill Energy in 4 weeks.
Bobby's volunteer.
Yeah. No, that's I mean, that's the thing. Like, I guarantee you, if somebody wanted to, they could just go out to a number of locations in West Texas right now, anywhere in the oil field right now, and walk up to a SCADA box, and in most situations, be able to have a field day. But that's the thing. It's like, I don't, anyone that's ever built any kind of software you quickly understand that it's more about fixing the broken shit than it is about making it work.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it's kind of part of it at this, or, table stakes with that kind of stuff. But it is just one of those like very unenviable positions. I feel like if you're in the IT group, because you're literally being pulled in complete opposite directions.
And
right?
it's one of those things where it's hard to get credit.
Oh yeah.
So if you,
especially in our industry where anything IT or data is seen as a cost center and, do more with like that's,
and if nobody hears about you, it's good. And if they hear about you, it's a bad thing. So you never get credit for not being heard about.
Right.
It's interesting to look at how, so I find like in oil, in all industries, the heavy industries, the capital intensive industries are really different than the tech industries. And yet we keep looking at tech for how to manage data. Yeah. But they're such different companies because they don't have, if you ran the wrong ad campaign, you're fine.
Yeah.
If we order the wrong equipment or install the wrong pipe or blow up a well, like it can be game ending. And so, as we think the risks for us or the risks for if you're Caterpillar or GE are just completely different. And looking at how, when any of those organizations really embrace technology and how they're able to connect it to the decisions of their organizations and how when things are working, because we all kind of go through ebbs and flows of when it falls apart. Those are the companies I look at for trying to understand what can we change about our mindset in oil and gas to connect technology to the activities that we're involved with when the risks are so high.
Yeah. And we talk about, this all the time. I mean, again, it's like, oh, Spotify was wrong. Let's go to the next song. So what? But I think, John talked a lot about this too, because you came from the mechanical background and you did some of that more like just in time type, lean manufacturing. And it's like, and again, like that's the hard thing about our world is that the facilities and everything moves moving all the time. But at the same time, that doesn't mean we can't pull things from there. But, those are probably a better analog for us to go off of than looking at, well, Google does it this way. Why don't we do it that way?
Yeah. Well, that's the big thing that, I've looked at this a lot and thought about it a lot. And, Google everything is on their platform for the most part. Right. So it's like they control all the data inputs, all the data sources for them. I know that's not true, but generically,
I was like, it's what they want you to believe.
Right. But it's like, so for example, CAPTCHA is such a great example and use case. Like most people don't realize that that's just you training their computer vision model. And it's like the way that they implement that is so like well done in my opinion, right? It's facade. Well, it's not really a facade for security, but it is a security element. But in reality, you've been having the world train your models for you for free for, I don't know 10 years, however long CAPTCHA's been around. And so it's like, those are the things where it's like, hey, how do we learn from that and implement these feedback loops into AI for oil and gas or things like that? We can't control all the data sources because we know that's not how the oil field works. The service companies have all the data and they share it with the operator. There's that weird data relationship where it's like operator owns the data, but they don't generate a large majority of it, right? It's generated from Halliburton, somebody, whoever. And so then that's where everything starts to kind of really fall apart with the structures and the field names and just normalizing. We don't have any standards, at least outside of drilling, around any of that stuff. And that's where things really start breaking down. Whereas if I'm Google, I have my data standard and my data schema. And anytime someone fills out a form, it's going to be in that schema and standard.
Yeah, but their structure isn't constant, right? Like Google or Amazon are good examples of companies that have been evolving in how they've approached what they're doing. And the CAPTCHAs are an interesting one because I think of that as being like a network effect where they've, and they were able to connect it where they had a need and they were able to build basically an internal network that had a positive feedback loop for them on their systems. But another part of that is they got really clear about what's the data we have and what's the thing we need to learn about it. And I think that's where oil and gas has the biggest problems is we have loads of data and we are afraid to share it because we're worried somebody else will figure out something before we do.
Right.
Even if it's on something you have like a well you have partners on, if one of your partners figured out something, you would still be your next in line to learn once they figured it out. And I think that we're so worried that we're proud of ourselves for being super smart. and having the smartest employees, the smartest teams, and then we're afraid to share a lot of data because we're afraid somebody else might be smarter.
Yeah.
And I think that's something we can learn from the true digital companies, that they are getting really clear about what's the data that I care about, where's the value to my business in this mass of of data, where's the information that I can pull from it, and what do I need to do with that? And the captures are like a concise example of Google doing that. And I think figuring out ways, what would be the feedback loop that you'd want in oil and gas? You know, how many times it took a long time for Combo Curve to come up with a marketable decline curve tool that took off like it did. Mm-hmm. And yet we still don't have, they probably have something, but a feedback loop on decline curves and engineering work. That seems like something that should be manageable, or petrophysics, or there's lots of things.
And then the decline curves are a huge one where it's just like, and to your point, like all these companies have some really smart people. And then I guarantee you at every major company and even tons of mid-size,
number of hours are devoted to the same job.
Yeah. There's still some kid that came out of college as a petroleum engineer and he's writing a DCA thing in Excel or Spotfire or whatever else. And it's like, no, this has been solved for a long time. You know, why can someone from Shell just share their damn, Python script already? Like that,
I think if people weren't solving it the same way every time, I think it'd be more interesting.
Yeah, if it was a novel approach,
right? Like, but everybody's got rate, time, done. Yeah. All right, somebody got fancy and did rate cum or like it, but there's not. If you were coming at it from a different way, and
almost like what kind of Biota was doing at one point, right, where they were using declines from molecular stuff to like that's a novel approach, and then yes, maybe that is a competitive advantage, and maybe you want to retain that,
or maybe not,
or
but at least to try something different
and see how it can be enhanced, right? Because you get more smart people on it. Like,
no, the perfect use case for that as a frac guy is Frac Pro was, and probably still is, the industry standard for frac acquisition and in van frac work, right? Everything in the van for the most part goes through Frac Pro. All your stages, all your volumes, it does all the calculations, it does all the math for you. As an engineer, one of my jobs was marking, breakdown, if we were dropping balls or whatever, flush, ISIP, you're marking things in the chart. I did that and I know people are still doing that. Why wasn't any of that data stored and then fed directly? Like, you had thousands of people using this for decades, and then they still had to develop a new way of like they should have been the first ones to come out with automated stage tracking.
Well, or ways. I mean, I think about completion. That's a challenge. I'm always excited when I meet somebody that's working on something or has a service or is kind of playing with the idea of having data around completions, especially if right after a frac, you could score if it was a good job, which is different than did you do what you thought you were going to do, but did you do a good one?
Yeah.
And the amount of the lack of knowledge that we have on that is amazing for one of the most expensive parts of our our assets.
Well, then it comes down to what teams value though too. Like, is it speed? Is it how well you fracture the rock?
No, the completion engineer is going to have a very different bonus and comp structure than the reservoir engineer in most situations, where it's like the completion engineer is focused on AFE and number of wells, and the reservoir engineer is focused on production. And it's that in and of itself is part of the problem in a lot of my opinion, right? Is like you have teams that have completely different comp structures that are incentivized very differently. Therefore, they don't work. Like, that's exactly, not to go full conspiracy theory, but like that's exactly what the government would do if they didn't want people sharing information, right? Like, they would silo them and they wouldn't let them share, and they would incentivize them differently.
But even like, I mean, to go even deeper on a more theoretical level, like spacing.
Yeah.
Right. Spacing is not necessarily a geologic, or engineering thing. It's also an economic thing. Like, if oil's, $120 a barrel, I'm going to pack those things in nice and tight, cause I can afford them. But
get out,
if it's less, then I'm going to go more and I can get, but you might be destroying value later, but if it's about keeping the lights on now, I mean, there's all these different levers that you can pull or that decisions are made on, and it's not a one size fits all.
No, I think that's the craziest part about the completion side. Is just, there are so many knobs to turn, right? Like, stage spacing, I mean, your perfs, the fluid rate, the fluid chemistry,
diverter, whatever.
Yeah, the amount of sand, the loading of the sand. Like, there's just and that's just the well. right? And then you have all the rock and shit, of course, on top of that.
But now you have like simulfrac and stuff, which
Right.
is like
Then
a
you've
huge
got-
deal. Like, you can zipper twice.
Right.
You know, like,
That's thinking of it in a vacuum too, right? Not with any existing production, with any pressure sinks, with any depletion and all that stuff.
Faulting,
And
right?
but that's the real world that we live in, where it's like, oh yeah, there's this natural fault that runs right across, and guess what? It takes the frack and runs it over to this well.
That's his point earlier, right? Like, I mean, like you can design all these perfect things in a pretty little vacuum, and then
I was thinking there's not a textbook for that.
No.
Yeah, and then the real world comes in and says, no. Yeah, fuck you. I'm sorry. Like,
So I'm going to come back to the completions, but I think there's like two parts of it. There's one, which is what are you chasing? And so what are the KPIs? What are the metrics that are actually useful?
Yeah.
There's an investor, Michael Malbison, and he's an amazing person to read for a number of reasons, and a really good synthesizer of a lot of complicated concepts and thoughtful ideas. But listening and reading him, I've learned of the term a useful statistic. So you can have a term that is, you can think of 10-year return on invested capital. It's sort of like, that's the thing we want. And so I want something that's predictive of that feature. But I also want it to be persistent, which is as I measure it today and again today and again today, and then tomorrow, I want it to be sort of today's measurement to be predictive of tomorrow's measurement so that it's fairly consistent. It's not bouncing all over the place. And so there's some statistics you could use to, like on time series analysis, to figure out, to say how much noise is there, what's the rate of mean reversion, as well as how correlated is it to the metric I care about. And that you think of a matrix of predictive and persistent, and that's like sabermetrics for baseball.
Yeah. Say that sounds like John's trying to do his thing for his fantasy draft.
No,
where
that's
he's trying
exactly
to predict how consistent a player is week to week. Would I rather have the guy that gets 12 points every week or someone that gets 30 and then 6?
So there's we're going to come back to completions. But so on that one, so if the person that's swinging, there's like their mean performance. And if somebody is swinging and is able to get away from that mean of the group or their mean and stay sustainably above that mean or below for a longer period of time, you can attribute skill more to their performance, and the faster the rate of mean reversion, whether that's because of they're involved in a chaotic process, so that's oil and gas, or they're just a more erratic slugger. That's skill may be less of an explanation for what they're doing. And so you can look at the rate of mean reversion as a way to assess how skillful their activities or how much their results are attributable to skill versus luck. Yeah. Which is it's how you create.
It's a derivation
for constructing your fantasy team.
Yeah, no, it's a derivation of the mean and the standard deviation away from the mean. And so it's like, it's the same thing.
Well, it's not just distance.
It's the variance
it's
as well.
How long it's taking them to come back. So if you're able to hold a small standard deviation above the mean, but you're able to hold that over a year, that's saying that there was something that was happening there where you should quantitatively at least attribute more skill to that behavior.
Right.
It was something you were doing is responsible for that. But I think like in oil and gas, how amazing would it be to be able to do the same thing to our engineers or our completions and start giving people using that kind of concept, one, to chase better KPIs and to think about corporate strategy and how do I feed that back down the chain of my organization so people are chasing things that are actually relevant as opposed to EUR or pounds pumped into the ground or cost. And if you can turn that into a feedback loop, that's a positive thing. Or if you can use it to find the right metrics, so that's that persistence predictive, finding the right metrics to be giving people. So you can give engineers feedback on, did you do a good job or did you just get lucky? And if you can tell them, are you in service of things that we actually care about, or is it just a familiar metric?
Yeah, or the company really I mean, like we talked, we were trying to do this back in the day, but I mean, like if we can provide them like a template, this is what a perfect or good frac looks like. I mean, like, all right, are you too aggressive, not aggressive enough, getting up to rate? You know, are you getting to breakdown? I mean, how long, like certain things. But again, then you give a cookie cutter thing, and is that even what you're giving them? Is it even representative of the rock or the geology?
How sure are you that that's even what you want?
Yeah.
So I think that's a place where I start to break from the engineers. I feel like I'm often the geologist that's in the friendly camp with engineers. And then once we start getting into over-engineering or overconfidence in our engineered path through something like completions, I think I go more to the data. So we were talking about completions and spacing and perf design and kind of how we design the development intensity of a square mile, say. There's a lot of fun stuff I find in the data to go and check. As you said, there's some trade-offs between completions and economics.
Yeah.
But because that's complicated, we kind of assume it's sort of 1-to-1. Half my completions doubles my economic, or I can double my well spacing or something. But in every basin, you can check and just kind of get a sense of actually what data, what's the slope of that relationship. And in our heads, it's usually we think it's 1-to-1, and I've not yet seen 1-to-1.
But you might take like lateral length. I mean, like, all right, we're doing 3-mile laterals. Like those fracs are not as efficient at the toe as they are.
That's such a good point. Yeah. Well, or that even when you look at the production, right?
Yes.
You don't, a 2-mile producer at year 2 does not have the same volume as 2 1-milers.
Yeah.
So we all know that. So what happens then when you start having more wells in a unit or further, and how you think about the production trade-offs and with completions?
But the economic trade-offs are huge, especially on that drilling side.
Yeah.
But the question then is, how do you be getting your organization or your subsurface teams to get calibrated on what those trade-offs are? Because decisions are all about trade-offs.
Yeah.
And so turning things into trade-offs instead of models, and models can be useful for figuring that all out. But I find that's a place where all the excitement about machine learning, people are getting a little bit lost and forgetting what the point is.
Right.
And I think you can do a lot more. You can do a lot of damage with simple models focused on things you actually care about, like cash flow. And I don't care what the curve looks like on my production. I just want to see what are the levers that we've pulled and what's been their correlation to outcomes that I care about.
Yeah.
And you can often learn a lot. Like in DJ, we see for a large area of the field, there's a remarkably almost insensitivity to frac size. So wells have doubled their frac size for similar spacing, and they seem to have no impact on interference.
Yeah.
And so that's not the model I had in my head.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's something in each basin. I've looked at it in some others, and you start seeing more relationships and in different basins, and understanding that and being able to get calibrated, and sort of, instead of just saying, I have a belief that such and such ought to be the case.
Yeah.
That's great. But then there's the real world.
Yeah. You got to prove it.
And there's so much data now.
Yep.
You just kind of finding creative ways to bring it together to, I call it feature engineering, but figuring out what are the metrics that you can use that help you build a story in your head about what's happening, and then trying to figure out what do you believe that's wrong that we can change how we assume our fields should be developed.
And I think that's one thing I would kind of always go back to, is people lose the heart of like the words data science. Like when we all learn the scientific method. My daughter just learned it in 3rd grade, but you have a hypothesis, but are you trying to prove your hypothesis, correct, or are you actually going to test it and be willing to accept if your hypothesis is wrong?
It's I was really disappointed, or just sad, when Daniel Kahneman died this year. And from him and his work and sort of people that followed on from him, I've become much more appreciative of the kind of the problems in the human operating system, sort of the way our brain works, where when faced with a challenge, we kind of go straight to validating our priors as opposed to proving ourselves wrong. Or Philip Tetlock, he did wrote the book Super Forecasters, and ran these forecasting tournaments. And I think he had a line that beliefs are hypotheses to be tested, not treasures to be guarded.
Yeah.
And I think in oil and gas, I think people nod their heads and believe that. But then as organizations, you could look at all the white papers. All of those are guarded treasures put on a pedestal, as opposed to, hey, here's something I believed, it's wrong. And here's how I showed it was wrong. I learned something. We don't talk about learning. We talk about pride and how much how right we always were all along.
Well, that's part of the problem, right? Is that
absolutely
that's essentially become it's an award, right? It's a prestigious thing to be whatever of the year or author, or.
And I'm not trying to like knock on.
No,
I think the papers are super useful, but as a metric, we don't have, like in academic publishing, there is. They're annoying sometimes, but there's an incentive for, you can build a career by just tearing down other people's papers, but there's an incentive to tear things apart. And if you put something out and a whole bunch of people, it's a lot easier to make a career tearing down old ideas than coming up with new ones, which is fine. And it's helpful because it helps us hone in on where the problems are. And we don't really have that as much in the technical papers. We kind of look much more for saying how great we were.
Right. It's like, oh, well, I had this idea about frac hits and then I tested it out, and guess what? It worked perfectly because my data shows exactly what I wanted it to. Right.
Yeah, it's like if you were that great in 2012, then why am I going back and refracking these and getting, insane returns?
Kirsten Wallace, the guy I worked with, who was a lot of fun and very intelligent, wrote a paper, and they just went back looking to see how often was the scientific method like followed in a bunch of papers, and what the basic conclusion for it was. Very rarely. And that usually what happens is somebody collects some data, comes up with a hypothesis from looking at that data, and then tests that hypothesis against the data that they got the theory from in the first place and found, oh my God, it's there. And like, that's not you haven't really, there's nothing robust about that process. Yeah. You really ideated something and then walked away. And we just stop at this. I came up with a concept, as opposed to getting rigorous about saying, what does it mean? Is it a good explanation? Does it predict something broader than the system I'm just looking at? And does it apply to a broader situation than just this one ad hoc case?
Yeah, because this might work in one area of your basin and it does not generalize at all anywhere else.
I think this is where like the science engineering side kind of, there's a balance, and looking at how we approach machine learning and just the amount of data we have now. This is a funny thing about where there is a little bit of a difference, because the engineering world is much more ad hoc, solve problems and keep practical. And then the science side is much more come up with a theory. So it works in theory, or it works in practice, but does it work in theory? And that's a good caricature. But as the systems get more complicated, there is some value in trying to keep grounded in what beliefs do we have that we can update and change by evolving our theory. Yeah. And I think that's where the amount of data we have and what we use it for and how we connect it to where the real purpose of our business is, what the value is that we generate, where the cash flow comes from. To me, that's the exciting part of what we can do with it.
Yeah. And then it's also, are you willing to push those limits? I mean, you talk about like, say a Pareto curve or something like that. And like you have to, go to the extremes to understand what doesn't work, and it probably falls in the middle, but you have to push the boundaries to understand.
Right. You've got to establish boundaries in order to know what they are.
Or you've got to be willing to wait for someone else to do that, because you don't want to spend the money to do it. That's true. But then you're going to take the risk of being behind the curve on some of that.
I've got a question. So as a non-operator guy, how do operators, since both of y'all are on the operations side, how do operators encourage more tinkering, experimental experiments? Let's just call them experiments, right? How do operators encourage more experiments in a controlled way, scientific method, right? Because I've also seen that where it's like Shell did that in the Eagleford. It was like we did a pad and every well design was different, every frac design was different on each of those wells. And I was like, what are y'all learning here? You're learning that if you change shit up, it's going to be different, but you didn't control, like there wasn't a constant across any of them. Like that's a terrible experiment.
Right?
Yeah.
That's what most of them are.
Yeah, I mean, Conoco did similar when I was there and on the fringe of when I left. But I think they were trying to push the limits of like, the water to proppant ratios and just playing with all those things and rates. And then, but then like, did you flow them all back the same way?
Yeah.
No,
absolutely.
Or should you? Because if I did, high sand water issue, I should probably flow it back a lot harder than if it was a lot of water, but again, there's so many different things that impact the quality of a well.
Yeah. Well, but that's what I'm getting at, right? Is it's like there's all these variables to play with. As an engineer, I want to go twist and turn knobs and play with things and change shit up. But then there's also the business, right? Yeah. So like we have to make money, we have to keep lights on, we have to hedge, we have to do all these things.
I mean, it has to be educated guesses. You've got a bunch of experts. I mean, like we've got parts, the geology. We know this is a thinner zone, so let's try to do something that we think is going to, be a better strategy here. But understand that it's not going to generalize. We can't just paint with a broad brush, but you probably have to be more, let's try this in a specific place, or where it's if it's a fringier piece of our acreage, we already know it might suck anyways. So let's try something else here. And that's where you actually get the value that no one else is willing to go after.
Yeah. I think that there's a little bit of a challenge of getting, I think I just lost my train of thought completely.
Sorry.
You have a pause in your podcast.
No, it's okay. We can.
AI I just completely lost the rest.
AI will edit them out. It's we were talking about the challenges of experimentation.
So when you do the experiment, at some point you can do lots of tests. Yeah. And so when we do a test, what are we looking for? we're usually looking for, or my experience is what I tend to find teams are expecting to see is something, either an EUR difference or some production signal. But as you pointed out, you have your completions team, you have where your geologists put your wells, you have your development intensity, you have your frac, details of your frac, details of your flowback, details of your drawdown, your facilities. Did you have any pipeline issues?
That's a whole nother
and so then you have your volume on
surface constraints.
At the end. That's too much.
Yeah.
Unless you did a colossal test and you said, oh, what happens if I don't produce this well? Do I get anything? What happens if I don't frack it? Like, you need to do the knob you have to turn is so far, the lever you have to pull so hard to be able to resolve a signal through all of that. And we're trying to optimize on much more minute signals.
Yeah.
And until you have something that you're chasing where you're coming at it with some sort of theory about what's the change you expect to see that will validate or invalidate the theory you came in with. Yeah. If you don't do that, I think you're in trouble. And you're talking about like the scale, that's like design of experiment type things, which few companies do, lots of people talk about. And I think this is a place where the like lean manufacturing concepts come in, which is, design of experiment comes in there too. But how you can allow tinkering with purpose. And that's, I think Toyota and kind of Amazon has their own approach, but there are companies that have been able to make this work. It seems like that's a template that we can learn at least elements from for how to do it and actually get something, as opposed to, your completions team tries something but doesn't tell anybody. Yeah. And then 3 other people do experiments and you have them all come together and you never learn anything.
Yeah, no, I think I would be very curious to know how often that's happening, right? Where it's we're mostly an industry of wildcatters, and if you put an engineer in a box for too long, he'll figure out a way to go around the box and still solve his problem. So I would be very curious to know how many forgiveness instead of permission projects are out there concurrently running at the same time without.
They don't even have to be forgiveness. They could also be, a manager walks in and says, "Hey, I want you to try X," and at some point somebody says, "You know what? I can't fight you.
Yeah,
Here we go. I got too many other things to deal with. Sure, we'll do that." And that, I would say, how much value is destroyed in bad experiments that are just all you're doing is adding noise to your production.
Right. It's the manager coming in and like, oh yeah, we've got that bonus thing that we need to check off the list with AI this year. Let's go ahead and do something with that, so we all get it.
The sand company said they'd give us a couple 100,000 more pounds. Let's see what happens if I throw that in there.
Sure.
I'm curious. I think the other thing that you also pointed out is it's like we go in trying to prove a hypothesis that we already have. But I think the other part of that is like everyone should accept when it's not right and publish that. And like, that's where learning actually happens.
I say it a lot. I think it'd be such a fun conference.
No, because like an engineering failures conference, that's a great idea.
Well, I've seen those in the data world. Like they have like the happy hours where people just come and say, "This is how I really fucked up.
This is how not to do this.
This is how I shut people out of prod for 2 hours. But you actually learn from that.
Right. Well, like I think about that long-term downhole gauge job that we had where both of the gauges read the same exact thing and we had them recalibrated and everything. And the operator was like, well, there's no way that's right. It's like we had 2 independent sources verify this at the same time. They didn't agree with what it showed. So then we sent the gauges off to the manufacturer to make sure that they were calibrated and certified and everything. They were fine, but the gauges were wrong, not their hypothesis was wrong. And this was actually telling them something valuable and useful that they just didn't think about.
My well's not on a vacuum. What are you talking about?
Yeah, right. Wells don't go on vacuums. That never happens.
I think it's fair. This is where why I think like Kahneman is so important is I think just too few people understand kind of what the work that he's done to help us understand how our brains really work and how human it is to make that mistake.
Right.
And it's not like there's bad people. It's that the expectation is unreasonable, that their default case is going to be to pursue truth. And I think that's where like leadership really comes in. And in all these industries, as they get more and more complicated, multifaceted with lots of swarming us with data, learning to organize your teams and to reward people and incentivize and sort of have your rah go team moments around discoveries and disabusing yourself of falsehoods that you just believed. And every time you discover something new, to be like, yes, we have just stepped one step away from the model of the world that we had that was wrong, and moving towards a more truthful understanding. And I think that's because if you don't make that something that you can rally around, then it feels bad. Because like, I was wrong.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't like that feeling. I don't want to tell anybody I was wrong. But if you say, I discovered something, I now know more than I did yesterday.
Yeah.
And how small of a thing can I learn from? And I think building organizations around that and looking for organizations that do that, whether it's in tech, like the tech industries, or in oil and gas, or anywhere in manufacturing, that incentive seems to be one of the most rare things to see. That's critical to getting anything out of AI, machine learning, or data.
No, I mean, a failure at an operator, and at least from my friends and feedback that I've gotten, essentially results in, well, you're not going to get a budget for anything ever again, right? It's like people are terrified of failing at their, working at whatever company they're working at. And so it's like, well, that's a horrible culture, right? Like that doesn't work very well if everybody is just incentivized on agreeing with the same thing. And it's like, the older I get, the more I realize that, just the hubris of humans is just ridiculous, that we think we know so much. And it's like, we don't know shit about shit that we use every day.
Well,
right?
You can make it simpler. You can just say 10 years ago, looking back today at what we were doing, we didn't understand a whole lot of things.
Yeah.
We couldn't achieve the rates that we wanted. We didn't understand how many wells to put in. We barely understood target. Like we had very little idea.
But I remember 10 years ago, we were touting how much better we got in 4 years.
Yeah, right. We were so proud of ourselves then.
Yep.
And then 10 years on, we are at a completely different place now. I bet in 10 years, we're going to be there's a whole bunch of things we believe today that are just harebrained. And in 10 years, we're going to look back and say, well, we had no idea. Those idiots, except it's us.
Right.
And so you can choose today, like, how do you get your people? How fast can you make that evolution and move up that learning curve as fast as you can? And whether that's collaborating with others and sharing data, or incentivizing your team, or chasing the right KPIs, I think those are all things that we get proud about and then sit on our laurels. And that's the slowest way to get there.
Yeah. I think one thing I want to kind of bring up, I have kind of two thoughts on this, and then I do want to pivot into like more like the nitty gritty, kind of more technical side, like with Python and all that shit. But I think one thing here too, though, like we're talking a lot about science, and people, I think, kind of forget, in a way, engineers are not scientists, except for Bill Nye the Science Guy. All right. But like an engineer applies the science, right? Like a chemical engineer is not a chemist necessarily. I mean, like they understand similar domains, but like
that's a very
chemical engineer's job is to productionize the science that was probably done in a lab, essentially, right?
Yeah.
So they're not probably the people to be performing the experience or the experiment rather. And with that, I mean, I think you kind of hit on a little bit, like some of the biggest discoveries we've had, whether it's medical or otherwise, have been accidental. We found penicillin because he left it in the sink too long, right? I mean, like there's stuff like that. I mean, say even like refracts and like the different kind of refracts that we have, where they're, defensive or offensive. I remember at Conoco, we're like, this well did better, and it was next to a refract. We didn't do it intentionally at first,
right.
But then we saw the data, you're like, wait, why is this one doing so good? Well, we put a refract here. Now, shit, there's not a pressure sink. And and they're like, maybe we should start doing this. We should start pairing this with our new development.
Well, so one of, like on the medical connection, statins. I believe it's statins. There's a Nobel Prize for the woman that discovered statins, and they come from, I believe this is right. She basically found it in a ancient Chinese, herbal medicine book, and was able to figure out that she doesn't have any kind of medical training. She's not a doctor or anything. And she has a Nobel Prize for this drug that gets used all the time.
Sure.
And it's this, what could I learn from something that was old information that was recorded, and they didn't have a full understanding of what they were dealing with, but the hints are there. And if I can unpack it and connect it to my problems today, huge value. How many of us spend much time looking at conventional fields anymore? Not many of us.
Brian McDowell.
Yeah, right. So there's a lot of stuff that we've kind of, there's skills and information sources, or just knowledge about oil and gas we've been moving away from, and what we can go back to and take. What have we learned in the past that we can apply to the problems of today? And there's so much to be gleaned from that.
Yeah, we always say the best place to find oil is where it's been found before, right? Yeah, but we won't use the learnings.
Right. Yeah, we got to go over the learning curve start from the scratch.
That's like perfect. Flush volume is a perfect example of that, right? Like when I first started fracking, we overflushed every well after the stage, and then I went to work for a different frac company, and we mostly did conventional fracs, and you never overflush a conventional frac because it's got a lot more permeability. And then I'm sitting there like, well, I literally only knew to overflush a well. And then I go into the conventional world, and you will get your ass chewed out if you overflush by half a barrel.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, shit, I wonder if we're overflushing all these unconventionals. Like they have even less perm. Are we just moving all the perm even further away?
Both of these can't be true.
Right. Yeah. Like, but no one, it's just like these, no one learns lessons from the past and rolls.
We have a hard time
forward.
With it, yeah.
So, applied science manager at Verdad, what does that mean? And as far as like, especially on like the technical side, because I think the one thing, that John said, and I set out for this podcast was to share whether it's different tools or processes that people are using. So I'm just kind of curious, like, what does your data stack look like? And then what does it enable, at Verdad?
So there's been, one, I can kind of connect it to give you a bridge.
Yeah.
You're talking about the engineers not being scientists, and we have all this information. I think applying sort of scientific thinking to the wealth of data that's out there. And a lot of what I've done has been using public data and trying to build features and useful information out of that mass of data. And so little things which are, anybody can calculate on things like well spacing and well characteristics or production characteristics, and trying to build, sort of turn things into a vector, and then figuring out what's the matrix look like that converts that to explaining 6-month cumes, 12-month cumes, and trying to then understand trade-offs. But I think the biggest part of all of that is you can spend a lot of time and you could build complicated models. And I'm not generally a fan of complex models, but you've got to find a way to communicate it and connect it to the decision. And that's really where all of my attention goes. So things like mining surveys and getting well spacing and clustering pads and finding ways to kind of automatically do a lot of that. And automatically taking care of regularly pretty simple problems like petrophysical mapping, so that when those things are automated, you can do more involved discussions and get into more involved discussions about the trade-offs and how it relates with the goals of your asset. But for tools, most of what I'm doing is Spotfire and Python scripts.
Okay.
And
Python data functions within there, or just Python scripts outside to kind of move data around and then to consume it?
So we're on like a really old version of Spotfire. And so most of it's doing this, the Python and SQL type stuff.
What version, if you don't mind me asking?
I don't even remember. What are we at now on Spot?
14.
Yeah. So I
think 13,
we might be on 11.
Okay. We were on 11 or 12, not, I think we went from 11 to 14.
Yeah.
Honestly.
I think we just are kind of on a really basic version, but it works for us. And there's some reasons for why.
I don't know if you're back to like 7.5. Where that was the one everyone hated, going from like 7 to 10 or whatever. They made that big jump. But
no, I think we're past that.
Okay.
And we don't really, as a company, there's a couple of people that are Spotfire users. And
how big are y'all? I don't even have much.
For people, we're around 100, I think.
Okay.
So a lot of it is like using it, everybody lives by PowerPoint. So it's building PowerPoints and trying to show people data relationships and building them into sort of, as we go through and do like pad reviews and planning our development, trying to connect what our expectations are based on so well spacing comes up a lot. What kind of development intensity do we want? One that came up that was in the last couple of months was we had done actually a little bit what you're talking about. For reasons, we'd kind of changed some of our perf design, but we were getting starting to see some production results that we didn't fully understand and weren't really expecting, and trying to figure out to what extent do the perf or other things explain, or does that explain what kind of correlation is there between that and the results that we're seeing? And I find one tool that's been really interesting that I've used a couple of times has been to build like really basic models like a random forest and regressing a suite of parameters and spending a little time trying to figure out which of these are non-correlated. How can I build some non-correlated features, which I think is something we don't spend enough time on. And once you get your feature set, run it through a random forest to forecast the outcome you care about, and then applying sort of a Shapley analysis to understand the relationship of what is a change of some amount, what kind of effect is the model saying that will manifest in the outcome. And so it gives you a mechanism to start saying, oh, if you increase your stage length by 50 feet, all things being equal, I expect that to have a impact of dropping your 12-month cume per foot by 2.5 barrels per foot. And you could even say for different lateral lengths, maybe what does that mean? And it gives you it's a language where you don't have to spend a lot of time talking about the model. You're just it's letting you speak about the higher strength nonlinear relationships, and with some charts and diagrams that they're fairly intuitive. Because that's one of the challenges I think the really advanced like data folks run into, or the modeling people will run into, is how do you communicate and build intuition about something trust, that's really something that's really complicated and nonlinear, when our brains at the end of the day we understand linear, and once you go multivariate nonlinear, most people say black box just because we can't keep up.
But even like a random forest is nice because a lot of times you can break it out and you can see the decision tree that.
You could definitely do that.
Even just basic stuff though, right? Like, I mean, as an engineer, especially with how bad public data has gotten these days, it's like, I want to see the root of the data and how we got to whatever you're showing me. Because I just need to know, as an engineer, and then I get frustrated at the same time when Colin's like, okay, show me how you came to that in this Power BI plot. I'm like, damn it. It's like, okay. So it's tricky, right? Because you want to give it, because mostly engineers, we want to know the why, regardless of what it is. But then it's like, okay, there's a lot of complicated shit going on here. And sometimes we don't even know the why. We just know this is how it worked and this is what popped up.
Well, that's what I find. So my master's was tectonic modeling and structural geology stuff. So I love that world. But when we start talking about sort of completions modeling and talking about the details of what's going on 50 feet outside of the wellbore, how are you going to validate that? Like that's really a tough space to live in.
I completely agree.
I love seeing a lot of what people do, but my skepticism goes through the roof. And I get concerned that we start then saying, well, what kind of fracture intensity have I generated out here? When actually nobody cares. What you care about is what kind of, what's my return on investment? And I think you can go to simpler metrics, and that's what I find is useful and communicates well. And you could have a technical team that could really understand a lot of those details. So to get to the why is this affecting the realized returns that I'm getting on my frac, my investment? But the models that give you high detail there, it's hard to validate. I don't really know how that's. Large companies that probably has more use for us. For us, we are cash flow focused, and that's just not. I try and help people see sort of the you think of the tornado chart of how important are different features, and to be able to see, petrophysics is really low on the list. Frac size is really high. I love petrophysics. I love geochemistry. And then I'm coming in and saying, these are really low order, like in DJ, petrophysics is a low, at least as I've seen it fairly consistently, as a low impact as far as explaining the variance in production. And one reason for that is not because petrophysics doesn't matter. It's because the variance in the petrophysical properties is low compared to the variance in all the other stuff. And I think that's a place where I'm constantly trying to bring calibration. So you ask me, what's the role of the applied science manager?
It's like a statistical property, right?
Yeah.
It's just a property.
And but trying to keep focus. So as a company, we don't get lost in, hiring more and more complex answers to what's the physical characterization of what we're looking at, unless you can come up with a completely different angle to approach it than what we're doing. It's not really worth spending the time on.
Yeah.
Now, you want to talk about completions, lateral length, or things like that. Those matter a lot.
Yeah.
And we can spend a lot. Those are things that deserve more attention, or proppant intensity. And there's fluid is a really big one, but being able to put the attention into the stuff that's actually going to give you some value and helping the company keep focused on that, especially when, because we all have friends and somebody whispers in your ear and suddenly you find that there is a trend of the day that everybody's kind of wanting to spend a lot of effort onto. And if it's something that you can keep showing in your data is not the best use of your attention, to keep that focus on the stuff that matters that's a lot of what I end up trying, or I'm often, that's the war I'm constantly trying to fight.
Yeah, sure. And so much of it comes back to that 80-20 rule, right?
It's spot on. Well, I mean,
80% of the production is coming from 20% of the, the things. But if there's a lot of world to dig into in that 20%, and that's worth way more of your time.
Well, yeah. I mean, like I said, you've got so many knobs to turn. Just taking those from 100 down to 20 makes it a little bit easier to start figuring out game plans and how to do an actual scientific method.
I haven't done the analysis, so I can't say this is true. Maybe that says how my brain works, but I suspect it's not. That the paint color on your pipes probably doesn't matter.
Yeah.
No team's going to spend a whole lot of time analyzing the density of the paint on their pipes or on their tanks, but and I think that there's a number of things, like I say that because it's a joke and everyone would agree, but if you find that there's other things that are of a similar importance to that are familiar metrics to chase, those are the kinds of things where I find it really fun to be able to say, this is where we're hitting a threshold of things like below this level, or here's the tier of things to not pay attention to. Yeah. And in fact, I think of something that I've found useful, instead of trying to tell people, here's the optimum that we should go for, because actually that's a really hard answer to give, is much more to say, here is the operating envelope to stay out of.
Yeah.
And inside of this,
here's
optimize to your heart's content, because I don't know what the right answer is, and this is where you should play, and this is where your completions engineer should bring their expertise to work. This is where my production engineers can really actually affect some changes.
That's where engineers live, right?
Absolutely.
All my education is around figuring out formulas with bounding conditions, right?
Like whether it's physics or derivatives. I think this is where the algorithms can really help you, or data analysis can help you figure out what to avoid, and just kind of put some areas that if you're going to walk into this space, you better have a damn good reason, because everything we've seen so far says, this is where the dragons are, and just stay away from the dragons.
And the return on your investment of time is very low.
Absolutely. Or the expected value starts getting negative because you're walking into something where the downside tail starts getting colossal.
Yeah.
Another person who just died, Charlie Munger has a line about him and at Berkshire Hathaway, and saying it's amazing how much money or how successful we've been just by looking around and seeing what doesn't work and then not doing that.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot to be taken from that in oil and gas. We really want to chase, and we're using algorithms to optimize. And optimize is hard, but figuring out what doesn't work is so much easier. And so to go and look at your data sets and say, all right, what's the terrible ways that people have operated? Yeah. You have loads of examples to work with, because as we were talking about 10 years ago, 20 years ago, we made loads of mistakes. So
and they were educated mistakes.
We went into them intending for them to work well. We thought we were doing a good job, but given technology available to us today, we can do better. And to be able to use that to rule out areas, or also to say, come in and you start working with your engineers and saying, here's an area where something, a data space that performed really poorly. And they say, oh yeah, it's because they were running gel with all of that while they did it. If you remove the gel, maybe everything else works. And you can start coming up with theories of things that are worth testing.
That's how we came up with today's modern frac design.
Exactly.
No one's running gel anymore.
Right. But
no, I mean, we were running 30-pound, 20-pound crossing jobs in the Fayetteville.
Well,
right?
and
why? Why?
Sliding sleeves and everything else.
Yeah, Packers Plus, man. It's no, I think that's where my next question was going to be, is like, engineers have I'm an engineer, so I take full responsibility for this. We have this ability to get really deep in the weeds on shit that probably doesn't matter most of the time. And so I think that's another thing where it's like using data to help drive your focus, because a lot of the times it's like frac hits, for example, right? Like people were doing all these fucking networks and these meshes and importing every single natural fracture from the frac log. Like they were going to insane detail, importing that into the Petrel models and the
awesome
grids
studies,
and all
by
this
the way.
stuff.
I love seeing
right?
that.
Like, but yeah. And then you had SRVs and all this stuff. And then it's like,
so what?
Right. So like nothing really came about that. And then you had the Devon FDI stuff where it's like put a pressure gauge on an offset well and you can see the communication, and then you can literally calculate the travel time and all of this stuff. And it's like, hey, the simplest answer actually was one of the most effective ones potentially, but engineers, myself included, don't necessarily always look at that.
Oh, we have
the simplest answer. We want the complicated one.
So there's a number of people. I mean, I mentioned like Berkshire Hathaway and some of these other people. There's a lot of the investing world that I find really interesting because they deal with, you have a trading floor of humans dealing with this flow of information that's assaulting them. Worse, every time you figure something out about the market, it starts to undermine, and that the market starts changing. A nice thing about reservoirs is they don't change once you learn something about them. So our job is actually a little bit easier.
Or we can model the pressure drops and all that stuff.
Sure, but like if you know what the pressure drop is, it's not like the physics of fluid expansion doesn't change just because you studied it.
Well, yeah, but we also it took Dave Kramer's paper, I don't even know when that was, early mid 2000s, that got rejected by SPE for whatever reason, where he was talking about this case study they did in the Barnett. They went in existing field, right? They had producers on either side. They could not frack the well between them. That was a new infill well. So then they started looking at it and they're like, hey, what if we look at this as a pressure system like a reservoir is? And we see that, oh, these have been on production for a year. They have a pressure sink. We're adding new pressure here. So all that fluid is probably going to those pressures. Let's shut them in. Let's let the pressures build up. And then they came back and they had no problems with it. And it's like the fact that we weren't even in, this is a number of reasons behind this, but like we weren't even looking at the fields as a whole, right? Like the engineers were looking at the well that they were working on and not anything around that well and whether that was going to have any impact on it or not. And it's like, it's such a simple thing, right? Like when we were talking about the FDI stuff, I vividly remember distributed load from my statics and dynamics class in college, where it's like, I push a force on this table. If I know the dimensions and I can read the force from any point on that table, I can back out what that force was. And I know where it originated from. It's like, that's literally what we're doing with a frac and an offset well. You've got a pressure reader, and then you've got a force being applied to the rock from over here. And then it's just a distance and it's velocity, right? Like, and so I was like, well, shit, how do we not?
But even there though, you have to make some assumptions about,
you've got to make a lot of assumptions about the rock.
And that's
right?
like what you're saying, like there's certain parts of the petrophysics side that are, we just have to assume are constant enough, right? Sure. And then like the other things are the things that we can actually impact.
I mean, permeability, right?
But
like,
you've also got, I think you're like another part of what you're describing, because we were talking about good explanations and understanding these complex systems, is you're talking about a situation where somebody looked at it and said, I have a problem, and then started to think about what's a theory that can explain the problem that we're seeing, and how do I condense it down to something that is simple as possible, but no simpler, and has like broader application that's not just to the one situation I'm looking at, but actually is telling me something about the way the world works. Yeah. And that sounds, I mean, it sounds awesome. Like I don't think I've read that paper, but that's the right, a healthy approach to how to study something that we don't do enough of or forget. I think we get lost in like trying to keep our execution hat on and making sure we keep moving forward. And that's an awesome example of actually trying to learn something.
Yeah. No, we just don't do it enough. That's the tricky, like it's how do you incentivize that while also still being a profitable business, right? Because you can really screw that up really quickly.
I mentioned the investing side. So there are a number of myths about markets, and we have a fetish for complexity of kind of, once we say, I have my beliefs of what I expect the world to work like, and as soon as I see something's not working how I expected, we start adding layers on top of it so that we can say, I was right all along, there was this new additional feature.
Yeah, right. It's going to be in a vacuum.
Yada,
right?
yada,
Like,
yada. You're now
physics.
sacrificing virgins to make the sun come up because you don't want to release your like priors, this belief system that you've built. And I think getting, building organizations and understanding how humans are, that we have trouble giving up on ideas and that we're just going to add new layers of complexity, which will, and your smartest people are the best at convincing themselves and convincing others that they've got the right answer with more and more complexity. And that's, I think, something as an industry, we just don't have, we have a lot of pride and we don't have actually a lot of awareness of how human that problem is.
Yeah.
And as the industry gets more and more sort of nonlinear, so you could think of it, used to be, I mean, literally out in East Texas, people would drill bumps, right? Like you go find a hill and you you sink a hole in the ground. That's what you did. So that's pretty straightforward. Hill, hole, oil, done. That works. Okay, so now then you're in unconventionals and you've got parent-child interactions, frac, drawdown rate. There's just so much going on.
Horseshoe well. Don't forget the horseshoe.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's right. Well, and then all the LCM you had to pump in while you were drilling, like all sorts of stuff. It's now getting to a point where it's not linear. Yeah. And so we're just adding, we don't have healthy systems in our organizations to be able to be aware of whether we're adding layers of complexity that are helpful or if they just make us feel better. Yeah.
This was not where I thought this conversation would go, but I'm really glad it did. It's been a really good conversation.
Yeah, no, it's been really good.
Yeah.
We didn't get it nearly all the technical stuff, but it sounded like, I mean, outside, I guess the only thing I was curious, so you talk about Python scripts, like how are you orchestrating those?
Yeah. So I'm super basic on that. And I'm just writing in idle for the most part and writing like one-off little tools
so you're
that
the
work
guy
for
who
me.
uses Emacs or Vim or something. Like that.
And yeah, I should. And then I've been using GitHub a lot more. So that was a couple of years ago. I started really trying to move stuff into GitHub, just because I was running into version chaos.
Yeah.
And so then, and also searching around in GitHub and getting ideas of what other people have done, or trying to find scripts that people have written, because there's nothing special about Python.
No.
Except that the libraries are amazing.
Except that someone else has probably already done it.
It's so amazing. And what's out there. And so to go and find people that are not in oil and gas, like Stumpy is one I want to play with a lot more for time series analysis. But going and looking at what other people have done elsewhere and trying to figure, and
how can I
looking for what are other applications, sort of new angles on old problems that you can bring to oil and gas. I heard there's a paper, some guys, I saw them presented in Denver, and then they presented at ERTEC this year on automated top picking using the same technology that's behind Shazam. So Shazam figures out what you're listening to. The way it collects a fingerprint of the audio and then matches that with a bash. What's it called? There's a special array, and I can't remember what it's called. A hash table and how it's using it to figure out like what it's listening to and to quickly match that just to a different, basically taking the spectra of time series and using it to match. Yeah. So they said, that works for logs. So let's treat each log as a separate channel in the audio file, and then start throwing that at this at the same technology. And they built a tool to start doing that, and they're kind of playing with it. And I love it. I think like the concept
for sure.
is remarkable, and it's one of those. To me, it's one of my favorite examples that I've come across recently where somebody's taking a totally different approach. And that's where the technology to me is so much fun, is you can go see what's worked for somebody else and something that I can bring over and I have a completely different use for.
I mean, I don't want to get into too much specifics, but the company we used to work for, they had a solution where you could use, taking sonar shots, but then we're using a software that was developed like Cornell or something for like identifying birds.
That's awesome.
But again, like to pick the hydrostatic head or or scale detection.
That's awesome. But I think that's where the creative fun of where the oil and gas industry is right now. There's a wealth of technology, and there's loads of stuff that's just being thrown off, like it's aging out or it's not useful for other places. We're going to start bringing into our industry, and we're going to be able to use and finding sort of these novel uses for old technology or things we can pull from other industries or other. Yeah. I mean, the code is so fun because you've got some random guy out in India who just wrote something for fun.
Yeah.
Bird call identification. And suddenly you've got a use case for it. you just have the risk of creating that XKCD cartoon where everything's leaning on the work of some random guy out in Nebraska. But aside from that, it's amazing how fast you can get something off the ground and start just playing around. And when you start unlocking and realizing that there's a correlation that's connected to the value proposition of your business, it's really fun.
I think the Shazam thing is kind of funny though too, because I think there's a story, and I'm not confirmed, but I'm pretty sure it was oil and gas. And I think this like CEO or executive called someone in and like, hey, I've got an idea for an app. And it was like, if my phone could hear a song and it could tell me who sings it, like, yeah, it's called Shazam.
Yeah.
So like, and I'm pretty sure if that was oil and gas, it's just funny that it's come full circle and now.
Right now
we're utilizing this Shazam algorithm to actually do something useful in oil and gas. But.
Yeah, totally.
That's a good way to wrap this up. You want to do a speed round real quick?
Yes, just a couple.
Some books. What are some good books that folks out there on the data and tech side should read?
Or what do you read?
You'd recommend?
No, because I need to read a lot.
So, Team of Teams was recommended to me by Alex Fleming, and it is a look at the U.S. war against Al Qaeda in Iraq, and the connection to oil and gas is an understanding of how to work in dynamic and complex environments. So where the data flow is so fast and the environment is moving so quick that a top-down sort of decision structure will slow you down and stops you from being able to operate. And that's how Al-Qaeda was able to basically be defeating the US in Iraq, and yet they were wildly under-resourced compared to the US military. And once you switch, the same story actually works for the German Blitzkrieg in World War II, but it's the ability to give, as a management concept, to push decisions. So strategy can come from the top, but decisions should come from the bottom. And trying to you want your pumpers to go out to the wellhead and have the ability to make decisions that are aligned with your strategy without having to, with as much authority, and to do what needs to be done at the site of action as fast as much as possible. So I like that book a lot. Another fun one that I have 2 kids, and Range by David Epstein.
Yeah, the generalists will rule the world. Yeah.
So that really gets, one of my favorite concepts from that is that the world, and we're not playing, the world is not chess is not a metaphor for the world.
Yeah.
It's just too structured. What we're actually doing is we're playing Martian tennis, where you can see that there's a court and there's some balls and rackets, but you don't know what the rules are, and they can change at any moment without notice.
Yeah.
And the kind of concept of the book is about the role of generalists, sort of as a counter to the Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours.
Yeah.
And for kids, it really gives you a lot of license to calm down and not worry about
you're not
specializing right now, because it's not going to end their life if they don't.
That is a very good book.
And then I've mentioned Michael Malbison, and so his book, Success Equation, which is kind of a rough, I don't like the title because it sounds like it's some self-help book, but it really gets into sort of how sabermetrics could work and how it works from an investing standpoint in business, and thinking about what are useful metrics, and how quantitatively sort of the math behind how you do that. And then as he's approaching it from an investment standpoint, using it to design portfolios, which is much the same thing as sabermetrics constructing a team.
Yeah.
And I think all of those apply really easily to oil and gas, and are concepts that we're not really familiar with, and should spend more time with.
Awesome. Some good recommendations
really
there.
Good ones. Yeah.
All right, let's do the last one. Favorite social media follows.
Jim O'Shaughnessy on Twitter is like the happiest guy on Twitter, and he is, I like him a lot, and I find him, he's just gleeful and has good gifts, but also really good at thinking about investing and connecting with people that are in that world, who are thinking creatively about building businesses and using technology without being too proud about their own knowledge. He's my favorite. I think. I'm not huge on social media, and I've gotten off of it more and more of late. Kids are related to that.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll just stop with
Which is all pretty good. It's, go touch grass with your kids. It's probably better.
Yeah.
Better than just doom scrolling and ingesting just toxic
it happens
content. But, well, awesome. Well, really glad we get you in. I know, you're not always in Houston, so it was
this is awesome.
great.
It was really good to come
catch
in
up with you
and
when
see
you're
you
here.
guys.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks for having me in.
Thanks for coming, man. If you guys like what we're doing, please make sure to give us a like, go subscribe to the channel somewhere around here. And we'll see y'all next time. Appreciate it.